I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. When the United States launched strikes on Iran, Australia was quick to back the move. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says it's about defending global security, but critics say that argument sounds familiar. More than 2 decades ago, another Australian Prime Minister used almost identical arguments to justify joining Australia's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Back then, Albanese himself warned those decisions would redefine Australia as a willing backer of US militarism, no matter whether it's in the national interest or not. Today, political editor at Crikey, Keane, on why he believes the Prime Minister has undergone a remarkable transformation and what it means for Australia as the conflict grows. It's Saturday, March 7. Bernard, great to have you on 7am. You wrote this week that Anthony Albanese's transformation into Deputy Sheriff John Howard is complete. What did you mean by that?
People with, longer memories will recall that John Howard half accepted, half struggled with the suggestion that he might have been the Deputy Sheriff of the United States, both before the George W. Bush presidency and the Afghan and Iraq ventures, and afterwards.
And if terrorists ever get their hands on weapons of mass destruction, that will, in my very passionate belief and argument, constitute a direct, undeniable and lethal threat to Australia and its people.
The suggestion was that he was so loyal to the United States that effectively Australia was an agent of the United States and its foreign policy and military policy in this region. And it's hard to see much of a difference between John Howard and Anthony Albanese in that regard.
I want to see the possibility of Iran getting a nuclear weapon removed once and for all. And I also want to see a removal of the ongoing threat that has been there for such a long period of time of Iran endangering peace and security and stability, not just in its own region, but here in Australia, of course.
Australia is much more so than it was under John Howard, a base for US military activities aimed at China. We're a supply dump for US military supplies for a war with China. We're becoming a submarine base for them. We spent a lot of money building up RAAF Tyndall in the Northern Territory to be a B-52 bomber base. We have training for Marines here. We've become even far more integrated into the US military machine than under John Howard, and with the principal goal of fighting a war against a key power in our own region, which really does make us much more of a deputy sheriff, I think, now than under John Howard, even if the kinds of rhetoric and rationale that we're seeing from Anthony Albanese are, I guess, a kind of a poor photocopy of what we heard from John Howard around Iraq. There was a pretense back during the lead up to the Iraq war that international law mattered.
As a quaint notion.
Yeah, well, we're all agreed that now, except for the Albanese government itself, we're all agreed and the opposition agrees international law and the so-called rules-based international order is a thing of the past.
Question for Prime Minister Carney. You've said that Canada will not participate in US military action in Iran. So can you definitively...
Point is, there's a failure of imagination going on right now, and we're seeing it pretty strongly contrasted with Mark Carney being here and Anthony Albanese's response. Mark Carney, Canadian Prime Minister, has been very clear that, the world has changed. The international rules-based order is no more. International law has been junked. And, we've got to adjust to that.
And now, in a more uncertain, more divided world, Canada and Australia are middle powers charting our own course with confidence, ambition, and partnership.
So why was Anthony Albanese so quick to get behind America's strikes this week, given that, there is a general consensus that it breaches international law? Why did he come out so strong when other leaders like some of the Europeans and Keir Starmer took a more measured approach?
I think that Anthony Albanese's strategy with Trump is keep your head down. Don't say anything that might upset the Mad King in Washington. Keir Starmer obviously been reluctant to support the venture. refused permission for UK military bases to be, or air bases to be used. That earned him a rebuke. Trump's been teeing off on the Spanish government for, very openly criticising and again refusing to allow Spanish resources to be used in the conflict. Anthony Albanese seems to be absolutely terrified of the idea that Donald Trump might say something bad about him, and therefore Anthony Albanese preemptively almost, leaps to do whatever Donald Trump really would like. Plus, we've got a media environment which is very pro-US, particularly led by News Corp, which is an American corporation. And Albanese, of course, would prefer not to be criticised by the media for not being sufficiently pro-US. I mean, he's spent a lot of last year being sort of criticised by the media for not being sufficiently, basically grovelling to Trump. And, I'm sure that forms part of his political calculations about how quickly and how high he should jump when the Americans say jump.
If we delve into the mists of time, Bernard, and go back to the year 2003, a younger Anthony Albanese had a very different perspective on our involvement in the Iraq war, saying it was an unjust war with no UN backing. What's changed in that time to the way he now responds to conflicts like this in 2026?
I guess Anthony Albanese is the one who can answer that question, but there's a kind of epistemological question here. I think, did Anthony Albanese actually believe that when he said it in 2003? And have his views changed, or did he never believe it? And he was articulating that as a political statement, which is intended to strengthen his political position. There are people who are saying, look, Anthony Albanese has always been about Anthony Albanese, and his statements have always been, in a sense, performative. Whether that's true, obviously that's very cynical. I'd like to think that all politicians, even the ones that I have very little time for, actually have some sense of some guiding value. But, it is a pretty stark contrast between the Anthony Albanese of 2003 denouncing US militarism and the Anthony Albanese of 2026.
If we look at the political calculation here, the domestic political calculation here, Bernard, is the PM likely to regret going all in on this war if the war itself continues to drag prices up and affect our cost of living?
Obviously, the longer the war goes on, the more likely we are to get a significant and prolonged oil price spike and a gas price spike in its wake. That is going to have ramifications, but if people can see that it's primarily caused by a war, they're probably less likely to blame Anthony Albanese, even though he supports that war. I think that it will be another brick in, one kind of war, which is the perception that Anthony Albanese is, very reflexively pro-American and does not articulate what is, I think, a widespread view of revulsion toward Donald Trump that is abroad in the Australian electorate. We saw that since last May in the election result. And I think if Albanese finds himself too adrift of popular sentiment in regard to something that is as closely associated with Trump as this Iranian venture, then I think there'll be some sort of collateral damage.
Coming up, the scathing review the Liberals didn't want you to see. Bernard, in a classic example of the Streisand effect, the other big political news of the week was the Liberal Party election review. They tried to keep it under wraps because of a cranky Peter Dutton. That only increased the attention to it, and this week the whole thing was leaked. What did it say that was so bad?
Well, it was pretty critical of Peter Dutton. And speaking as someone who really has much sympathy for Peter Dutton, I think it was actually pretty harsh on Dutton. The other observation that the review team made was, which Nick mentioned and Prue Goward, made the observation that no one who contributed to the review was prepared to be self-critical, which is pretty funny. So everyone was happy to criticise everyone else, but no one engaged in any sort of reflection on their own performance.
It's that Spider-Man meme where half a dozen Spider-Men are all pointing at each other and blaming each other.
Exactly. Yeah, they're all pointing at each other, saying, "Look, that's where your big problem is." I think that it had touched on a couple of things that I think are really problematic for the Liberals, obviously. One is, quote unquote, the women problem. It came back to that issue several times and sort of made the point that, look, Liberals have been talking about this issue for a long time. No one's ever done a deep dive on how they can actually fix it. Angus Taylor, of course, knifed the first female leader of the Liberal Party. So
not a great start.
Yeah, probably not in a strong position to be leading the charge on, greater female representation. It talks about the age gap. and the fact that structurally, systematically, the Liberal Party is an old person's party. And Angus Taylor coming out so strongly against any sort of tax reform that might benefit younger generations at the expense of, older asset owners, people like me, probably sent another signal along those lines. And of course, the issue with migrant communities, which is really highly relevant given Taylor's almost made immigration, he said immigration is going to be one of his big issues. He's saying that there's too many migrants coming and they're not good enough, which is not the kind of signal that is going to win back migrant communities, who've shown over a course of a couple of elections that they're not overly happy with the Liberal Party.
I mean, you mentioned that the report was very harsh on Peter Dutton. He's even threatened to sue defamation. What did it say about him specifically that irked him so much?
I think it was the focus on his personal characteristics that I think really upset him.
Sort of character assessment stuff.
Well, it talked about him, the original version talked about him as being grim and introverted. It's obviously not characteristics you want in an alternative prime minister. That was taken out, but it also talks about, women not liking Dutton not appealing to female voters, which he took as a kind of a reference to the fact that has a quite distinctive appearance. Whether the reviewers intended that or not, I don't know, but I guess if I'd been described similar ways, I might think, well, geez, she's having a crack at the way I look's not too flash. But the overall tone of the comments about Dutton kind of suggest that he was a bit of a loner. He didn't trust anyone. He was a bit paranoid. And he concentrated power in his own hands. And as a result, everything got stuffed up. I think there are elements of that are true, but the idea that Dutton came in, almost like the mini-Trump that he was portrayed as, somewhat inaccurately, and somehow took over the party and took it off in directions it shouldn't have gone and, did all these crazy things that you don't do in normal campaigns. I think that is a little unfair. I think that overly focusing on either Dutton's appeal or the way Dutton did things risks kind of shifting the responsibility away from the people who allowed that to happen, which includes his parliamentary colleagues.
And what did the review actually say about the current leadership? I mean, you spoke about migrant communities and Angus Taylor's immigration agenda. What did the report say about Jane Hume and Angus Taylor?
Doesn't talk about Angus Taylor in person at all, doesn't name him. It reflects rather critically on the decision that was made in the budget lockup last year to oppose Labor's tax cuts, which obviously Taylor was part of. There's still a bit of mystery about whether, who drove that, whether it was Dutton and how much Taylor acquiesced. Jane Hume, on the other hand, is mentioned very critically for her extraordinary capacity to alienate migrant communities, and particularly Chinese community, with her throwaway reference to Chinese spies.
You don't need to go out that far on the polling booths, Claire. There might be Chinese spies that are, handing out for you, but for us, there's dozens, thousands, hundreds of young people that are out there handing out how to vote cards.
Imagine being the Labor operatives who saw that during the campaign. They must have just thought, you beauty.
That's what the newspapers are saying. That's what the newspapers
I think
are
they're
saying.
I think they're getting a bit desperate now.
It's really interesting to read the report about the issue of migrant communities and the fact that the Liberals are kind of a bit performative about it. It's a bit, go and have a photo op. And there are people, amongst the candidates who lost, there are people saying, we've actually got to really change our mindset about migrant communities. Amelia Hamer, who narrowly lost Keane, she made an absolutely fascinating observation that it's not like the 1970s. She made the point, look, people come here, but they don't sever their ties with their home country anymore. They go back and forth. They see themselves as being the product of two countries. And that's really at odds with the kind of hardline, if you don't like it, leave it kind of mentality of the right.
And finally, Bernard, as you mentioned, the report noted that past election reviews have identified some of these recurring issues like their problem with women, but the recommendations have been largely ignored. Will this time be any different? And what lessons need to be learnt most urgently by the Liberal Party? The
review is more interested in the structure and in how they solve policies and who was doing that. So it's trying to make much more concrete recommendations. And one of those is much more engagement with migrant communities and young people. And one of the things it observed was there's very few women actually within the leadership of the Liberals' secretariat or its campaign. HQ, and that's got to be remedied. So there was a focus on more doable recommendations, if you like, but the fact that they were so keen to bury it really suggests that despite the effort to actually make them more implementable, they'll suffer the same fate as previous recommendations. And obviously Labor will be hoping that, no, they don't get the memo this time and just keep on making the same sort of mistakes and alienating the same sort of communities.
Bernard, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
"7am is a daily show from Solstice Media. It's made by Atticus Bastow, Ariel Richards, Chris Dengate, Crystal Keller, Nicole Johnston, Travis Evans, Zoltan Fetcho, and me, Daniel James. Our theme music is by Ned Beckley and Josh Hogan of Envelope Audio. Thanks for listening to 7am. Have a great weekend.